If you examine the developments unfolding between Ottawa and Washington, it becomes clear this is no longer a conventional trade dispute. It does not resemble retaliation nor even coherent trade policy. What we are witnessing is something far more severe, a deliberate and calculated act with consequences that cut to the core of American industrial strategy. For years, the electric vehicle transition in the United States has been presented as a triumph of domestic innovation, American technology, American factories, American leadership. That narrative has now collapsed. With a single executive decision, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has brought it to an abrupt end. Canada has announced an immediate ban on the export of critical minerals essential to the production of electric vehicle batteries across North America. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, the fundamental components that power electric vehicles, from Tesla to Rivian to Ford's F-150 Lightning, are no longer permitted to cross the border. The ban took effect instantly, with no exemptions and no transition period. The assumption in Washington had been that the escalating tariff conflict was about familiar sectors: cars, dairy, lumber. President Donald Trump appeared convinced that Canada would ultimately yield, offer concessions, dispatch negotiators, and seek compromise. Instead, Carney targeted the one sector the United States cannot afford to lose. The repercussions of that decision are already reverberating through financial markets, factory floors, and the long-term prospects of American manufacturing. The president is furious. The automotive industry is alarmed. Yet much of the media conversation remains fixated on marginal tariff skirmishes, while the electric vehicle supply chain deteriorates in real time. To understand how this unfolded, we need to look closely at the past 72 hours. It began, as so many recent confrontations have, with escalation from Washington following weeks of unsuccessful back-channel negotiations over the USMCA review. The White House chose confrontation. President Trump signed an executive order imposing a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminium, in addition to the 25% tariffs already applied to automobiles. On social media, he framed the move as the largest trade correction in history. Canada, he claimed, had exploited the United States for decades and would now pay the price. The message was unmistakable: comply or suffer. It was a familiar strategy: shock, pressure, domination. What appears not to have been considered was Canada's position within the global resource economy. The response from Ottawa was swift and opaque. Mark Carney convened an emergency cabinet session. There were no leaks, no public posturing. For 14 hours, the Canadian government said nothing. Markets grew nervous. Commentators speculated. Within the White House, there was an apparent assumption that Carney was preparing to negotiate. He was not. At 7 o'clock the following morning, Carney stepped to the podium in Ottawa. There were no symbols of partnership, no shared flags, just the Canadian flag behind him. His statement lasted 11 minutes. His delivery was measured and unemotional. He did not mention the American president by name. Instead, he issued a declaration with immediate effect. Canada would no longer permit the export of strategic critical minerals to any country engaged in economic coercion against the Canadian people. There would be no grace period. There would be no exemptions. He then listed the materials: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earth elements, manganese, the foundational resources of the electric vehicle economy, all barred from export to the United States. The room fell silent. Journalists did not immediately ask questions because the significance of the announcement was immediately understood. This was not a symbolic response. Canada had effectively shut down the supply lines underpinning the American electric vehicle industry. The consequences were visible within minutes. Markets reacted sharply. Tesla shares fell 9%. Lucid dropped 17%. Ford's electric vehicle division, already under financial strain, saw its stock decline so rapidly that trading was briefly halted. General Motors' Ultium battery program, heavily dependent on Canadian nickel and lithium processing, saw shares fall 11% before midday. The Nasdaq Composite fell by 600 points in a single session, not due to earnings, inflation data, or monetary policy, but because a single country had switched off access to essential inputs. financial analysts struggled to respond in real time. One admitted, live on air, that the scenario had not been modeled. And that perhaps is the most revealing point of all. The assumption that Canada would always remain a compliant supplier, always say yes, was embedded deeply into American industrial planning. That assumption no longer holds. The second and perhaps most alarming dimension of this crisis lies in what can only be described as the mineral mathematics, figures that should deeply concern policymakers in Washington and which appear to have gone largely unexamined until now. Canada is not merely one of several suppliers of critical minerals to the United States, it is the supplier. The scale of dependence is stark. Canada provides more than half of the aluminium used in American electric vehicle battery casings. It supplies the bulk of the high-grade nickel required for cathode production. It controls some of the largest undeveloped lithium reserves in the Western Hemisphere. Graphite processing facilities currently under construction in Quebec were designed explicitly to supply American gigafactories. A rare earth processing facility in Saskatchewan, central to Washington's strategy to reduce reliance on China, has now ceased supplying U.S. buyers altogether. The implications are profound. Over the past 5 years, the United States has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in building an electric vehicle supply chain that did not depend on China. In that objective, it succeeded by transferring strategic dependence from Beijing to Ottawa. That dependency has now been severed. The Inflation Reduction Act, with its $369 billion in climate and industrial incentives, along with the associated subsidies, tax credits, and factory announcements, rested on a single foundational assumption that Canadian mineral supplies would remain permanently accessible. That assumption has now been invalidated. The effects are no longer theoretical. They are being felt on factory floors across the United States. A battery plant in Georgia, scheduled to begin production next quarter, has postponed operations indefinitely due to the inability to secure cathode materials. A lithium processing facility in Nevada is running at just 40% capacity after losing feedstock from an Ontario mine. Ford's assembly plant in Tennessee has sent workers home, using a term that should not be understated: indefinite. These are not Canadian jobs. These are American workers in American communities facing layoffs as a direct consequence of a trade confrontation with the country supplying the raw materials upon which their livelihoods depend. This is the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of the White House's strategy. Tariffs cannot alter geology. Resources exist where they exist, and in this case, they are overwhelmingly located in Canada. Which raises the question, why did Mark Carney choose such an extreme course of action? Why not pursue the more familiar Canadian response, targeted retaliatory tariffs on symbolic goods, followed by negotiations? The answer lies in Carney's strategic recalibration of Canada's role in the global economy. He recognized a reality that previous prime ministers acknowledged but declined to exploit. Canada's most powerful leverage is not its trade volume, its alliances, or its diplomatic standing. It is its natural resources. The modern economy does not run on oil alone. It runs on lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements. Canada possesses vast reserves of each. For decades, these resources were treated as commodities to be exported with minimal strategic consideration. That approach has now ended. Carney has drawn directly from precedent. A decade ago, China demonstrated how control over rare earths could be transformed into geopolitical leverage, restricting exports to punish adversaries and influence global technology supply chains. Canada has now adopted a similar approach, albeit with greater speed and transparency. While President Trump issued public insults and dismissive remarks, Carney was reportedly engaged in intensive diplomacy, speaking with officials in Seoul, Tokyo, Berlin, and Brussels. Sources indicate that he held an extended conversation with the president of the European Commission. The message was unambiguous. Canadian minerals remain available, but not to countries that pursue economic coercion. Reports suggest that South Korea and Japan are already negotiating emergency supply agreements with Ottawa. German automakers, including BMW and Volkswagen, are said to have dispatched representatives to the Canadian embassy in Berlin within hours of the announcement. This is not merely an export restriction, it is a strategic redirection. Canada is constructing a new mineral supply network that bypasses the United States entirely. Each country that joins that network further isolates Washington from the electric vehicle economy it had hoped to lead. The contrast in strategic posture is striking. The White House continues to pursue short-term leverage through tariffs. Ottawa is exercising long-term structural power rooted in control of essential inputs. In this contest, Canada is not reacting, it is repositioning, and at present it holds the advantage. The response from the White House has been marked by confusion and fragmentation. There has been no coherent counter-strategy, only a series of improvised reactions. President Trump addressed the issue in a brief press appearance lasting just 8 minutes, during which he characterized Canada's export ban as an act of economic warfare. He threatened to invoke the Defense Production Act, floated the possibility of nationalizing mining operations, and instructed American companies to source critical minerals anywhere else. That instruction reveals the central problem. There is no viable anywhere else, not in the short term, not at scale, and not without renewed dependence on China. The United States currently operates a single lithium mine. That facility in Nevada remains years away from full capacity. Domestic nickel production is negligible. Cobalt production is effectively non-existent. Rare earth processing in Texas remains a pilot operation rather than an industrial-scale facility. Executive orders cannot conjure mineral supply chains into existence. Resource extraction is governed by geology, not politics. Developing a critical mineral mine from discovery to commercial output typically requires a decade or more. Canadian policymakers are fully aware of this timeline. They understand that for the foreseeable future, the United States cannot replace Canadian supply. That is the leverage at play, and it is why financial markets have responded with skepticism toward Washington's position. The political fallout has been swift. Governors in Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, and Tennessee, states directly tied to electric vehicle manufacturing, have issued statements expressing concern. Not one publicly endorsed the administration's tariff strategy. Michigan's governor called for an urgent summit with Canadian provincial leaders. Georgia's governor warned that more than 12,000 jobs in his state are directly linked to the battery supply chain and are now at risk. Even within the president's own party, dissent has emerged. A Republican senator from Ohio publicly criticized the approach on Fox News, stating plainly that dialogue with Ottawa, not public confrontation, was required. Such remarks, delivered on a sympathetic network, underscore the level of anxiety within Republican ranks. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued one of its strongest rebukes in decades, describing the tariff escalation as reckless and identifying the mineral ban as a foreseeable outcome of economic brinkmanship. That assessment aligns with industry sentiment. The automotive sector, long supportive of industrial policy incentives, is now openly frustrated. Executives from Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis reportedly sought an emergency meeting at the White House. None was granted. Instead, they received public exhortations to build domestically and reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, an instruction disconnected from the practical reality that the required raw materials are not available within U.S. borders. The gap between political rhetoric and industrial reality has rarely been so stark. Each day the standoff continues, production slows, shifts are canceled, and workers are sent home. What makes Canada's approach particularly effective is its precision. This is not a blanket trade embargo. Agricultural goods remain unaffected. Energy exports continue, at least for now. The restrictions are narrowly focused on minerals classified as critical to advanced manufacturing and defense. The message is deliberate. This is not an attempt to destabilize the broader economy, but to constrain America's capacity to build its future independently of Canadian supply. This strategy directly targets one of the president's signature achievements. The electric vehicle provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act were presented as a cornerstone of industrial renewal. Factory announcements and job creation were claimed as political victories. Those same factories and jobs are now among the first casualties of the confrontation. The implications extend beyond civilian manufacturing. The Pentagon relies on identical critical minerals for fighter aircraft, missile systems, naval vessels, satellites, and advanced radar technology. The F-35 program alone depends heavily on nickel alloys and rare earth magnets sourced through Canadian supply chains. Defense officials have reportedly expressed alarm, with internal assessments warning that the export ban constitutes a national security crisis generated not by a foreign adversary, but by diplomatic miscalculation. The strategic damage is therefore twofold: economic and defensive. American security has been weakened not through hostile action, but through a rupture with its closest ally. Looking ahead, there are three plausible scenarios. The first is a negotiated de-escalation. Tariffs are quietly withdrawn, the mineral ban is lifted, and both governments issue statements reaffirming partnership. This would be the rational outcome, but it would require political retreat on both sides. For President Trump, such a move risks being perceived as capitulation. For Mark Carney, backing down would undermine the political authority he has built around defending Canadian sovereignty. The second scenario is prolonged stalemate. Tariffs remain in place. The mineral ban continues. The U.S. electric vehicle sector enters a sustained slowdown, while Canada redirects exports toward Europe and Asia over the next year. American manufacturers turn to alternative suppliers in Australia or the Congo at higher cost and lower reliability. The transition to electric vehicles in the United States is delayed by several years, and China ultimately benefits by filling the gap. This outcome appears increasingly likely. The third scenario is full escalation. Further sanctions, financial restrictions, and retaliatory energy measures drive oil prices sharply higher and push North America toward recession. Alliance structures already under strain fracture further. While this remains the least desirable outcome, it cannot be entirely dismissed. At present, the trajectory points toward a prolonged freeze, with the risk of deeper rupture never far from the surface. The broader conclusion is unavoidable. The United States built its electric vehicle strategy on Canadian resources. That was the foundation of the plan, the logic behind the investment, and the basis of long-term projections. In a matter of days, that foundation has been destabilized. Mark Carney did not seek this confrontation, but he was prepared for it. When a country that controls your supply chain is pushed into a corner, it will exercise that control. This episode has demonstrated a broader truth with global implications. Smaller states are not powerless if they understand where leverage resides. In this case, that leverage was always beneath the ground. The central question now is not simply whether the American electric vehicle sector will recover, but whether it can do so within this decade. And the political question remains open: whether this confrontation marks a strategic defeat or the moment Washington is forced to reconsider how it treats its allies. History in this instance is unfolding rapidly, and its consequences will be long-lasting.